Good morning, everyone. My name is Lukas Hämmerle. I have the pleasure to chair this session, which will be mostly about federated identity management related topics. The title of this session is called Better Safe Than Private, which is kind of a provocative statement. We probably also could have added a question mark. And as we will see in the following three presentations, well, there is a paradox between safe and private sometimes. On one hand, as a service provider, you would like that only those people can access your services that are eligible, so you want a safe solution. On the other hand, you need information to ensure that only these people can access your content. And in order to make a decision who can access the content and who cannot, you need attributes, you need information about the users. And of course, not all users are happy that information is released about them. And some of them would like to stay private. And basically, that's then a paradox. Now, we will have three gentlemen talking about this paradox, starting first with Ken Klingenstein, followed by Bob Hulsebosch, and last but not least, Roland Hedberg. They all are TNC all-stagers, so all of them have been at least twice presenting at TNC, so I'm looking forward to some very interesting and maybe even provocative presentations. And as mentioned, I would like to give the microphone first to Ken Klingenstein, which most of you probably know. Ken has been very active in the middleware and security community in his role as middleware and security area director of Internet 2. And yeah, he will set the stage for this better safe than private topic by talking about the paradoxes in this topic. So the stage is yours, Ken.
Thank you, Lucas. Can I be heard? Yeah? No?
Yes, there you are.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you. So the privacy paradoxes. That was I'm a recovering mathematician, so I brought in the one of the paradoxes that defines what we mean by paradoxes. Let R equal the sets that do not contain themselves. Then R is in R if and only if R is not in R. Thank you, Bertrand Russell. He did a lot of good work even before middleware. The logo is for an activity that has funded some of the work that you'll be seeing here. And I aim this towards. Press the laser button. Maybe it's that one. Okay. So a quick word about paradoxes. A word about privacy, and I'm going to be introducing some academic concepts here to frame that, and then some of the paradoxes, but I'm going to spend most of the time on a path forward because I'd like for us to move along versus just complain as I often do. So a paradox is a statement that is seemingly contradictory or opposed to common sense, and yet is perhaps true. It's a self-contradictory statement that at first seems true, and there's hundreds of paradoxes out there, including the interesting number paradox, which is the first number that can be considered dull rather than interesting, becomes interesting because it's the first number that wasn't interesting. They're cheap thrills, folks. You know, you can find a paradox wherever you want. So the trick here is to embrace paradoxes. And so I went to the deep philosopher Bruce Springsteen, right next to Bertrand Russell in terms of profoundness, and he said, "Don't take yourself too seriously, and take yourself as seriously as possible, as death itself." You can read all that. Be able to keep two completely contradictory ideas alive and well inside your heart and head at all times. If it doesn't drive you crazy, it will make you strong. Bruce came from the same state in the US that I did, but he got a bit more famous. Paradoxes as technical drivers. They are the essence of good design. One of the important things about paradoxes is that they lead us down the right path. Here are some of computer science paradoxes that we talk about a lot. Be liberal in what you accept, be conservative in what you send. That goes back to the IETF in 1904, I believe, or something close to that. There is no problem in computer science. This was actually mentioned by one of the other speakers in another session. It's a very popular saying. Does that apply to trust? Does indirection work in the trust space? Maybe not. I think one of the other things that flails at us is at what layers does integration need to happen? At the technology or the user experience layer. So Roland and I can get into a long argument about whether OpenID Connect or SAML is the true protocol, and frankly, it doesn't matter one iota. What matters is that the user experience be consistent across the protocols. So where we need integration is something that we have to think about deeply. And I think the integration is needed more and more as you get closer to the wetware that we are. Lastly, paradoxes are teachable moments to the user. And we have to find ways of beginning to illustrate that to them, because we're not going to nudge the user down a path of consistency unless we can show them the paradoxes that they've embraced so far. So a word about privacy. It's a vast space of issues, as complex and nuanced as security. I think we're just beginning to understand all of the dimensions of privacy. But privacy and security are two sides of the same coin. Back in 2004, I gave a talk in Washington, D.C. About shibboleth as it was just rolling out. And two gentlemen came up afterwards, very pale gentlemen, wearing suits, who said, "Thank you for your software." And I asked where they were from, and they were from Homeland Security and the Department of Defense. And I said, "This is privacy-preserving software." And they said, "No, it's secrecy-preserving software. It allows us to share information between our operatives without revealing to the other agency who our operatives are." And that's very important. So I was distressed and happy at the same time. We're going to be focusing on transactional privacy, where the attributes are exchanged dynamically for access control, though we will get into some offline instances of that. And so this brings in issues like minimum disclosure, constrained purpose, informed consent, and there's all other kinds of privacy conversations happening around, mostly at data at rest. So in the US, you can't accept credit cards unless you meet certain standards for holding the data at rest, et cetera. Not our part of the privacy conversation today. So privacy has been studied for a long time. And I realize this is a really small font, and I have a lot of slides, but the intent was to put it up there on the Terreno website so that you could go back and reconsider it. Alan Weston was an academic researcher who studied privacy for 40 years, beginning in the pre-technology days and moving all the way through to, I think his last studies were in the early 2000s. And out of some 400 privacy studies, he teased out 3 major categories of users: the privacy fundamentalists, the pragmatics, and the unconcerned. And he has percentages about each of those. One of the interesting things is wondering how those percentages will change over time. But I'm going to use this framing because it's the only rigorous academic structure around what is it that people think about privacy. Fundamentalists, pragmatics, and unconcerned. I think we probably have a room with very few unconcerned people, just by the nature of the topic. Another thing that has come out is a structure around the types of concerns, privacy concerns that people have. And this structure about collection, unauthorized secondary use, errors, improper access and invasion, turns out to be the structure that we want to use in addressing informed consent. So when we go and present information to users to help them make consent decisions, we want to structure it around these 5 categories so that they can get a sense of how the website that you're going to is responsive in those areas. So what are the central privacy paradoxes? The core one, which we all know, and frankly, which we all live ourselves, is the relationship between privacy concerns, attitudes, and behaviors. And particularly the concerns and attitudes are not often reflecting in behavior. For example, I'm concerned that I will be invaded by advertising. My attitude is to opt out. Oh, I want that rubber squeeze toy. I'm going to opt in. So one of the ways that the privacy community has addressed this is to consider persona. And those of us who are truly schizophrenic have several personas inside our heads. And so that's the way they wanted to do this. And we started to think about that for the privacy manager. And then the research is showing that persona is a difficult concept to actually implement because some attributes and concerns span multiple persona, and sometimes we don't know what persona we're acting in. That said, I don't know that there's any more powerful approach that we know now. There are researchers diving into this. Some of those researchers are looking forward to us producing data, honest data, that will help them categorize that, and I'll talk about that. Medical records must be highly private, and then we go on Facebook and we put the same damn information in that's in my medical record that I don't want anybody to see, and then there it is on Facebook. What are we doing? Privacy incentives for the relying party. This is tough. If you're a businessman, you want to know your customer. And you learn that in Business 101, know the customer. But on the other hand, we want to find privacy incentives. One of the more frustrating aspects of the research community is I asked them, so they do a lot of research on privacy and security issues, and they can't get to real data because there is no sandbox. So they use it on social sites. And what is your expectation of privacy on a social site? Pretty minimal. So again, the need for data, I'll come back and talk about that. And lastly, the privacy paradox of an American talking about privacy. What can I say? What can I say that isn't being heard by NSA? Okay, those are the paradoxes. So I want to talk a little bit about how we can get out of these paradoxes. And so the path forward is an orientation towards attributes more than identity. Effective end-user privacy managers. I'll be demonstrating one in a minute. And then embedding helping technologies within the privacy management system. And so some of that might be a trust mark to show to a user that says this site has been audited and vetted and is compliant with certain kinds of policies. Nudging is a very powerful technique. We've all gone to websites where they ask for a password because they're not federated. And as you begin to type your password, they give you a meter that shows you how strong or weak your password is. Can we adopt that kind of approach within privacy? Well, that's one of the big research efforts that's just gearing up now in the privacy academic research community. They're also doing research. Another path forward will be to do research on how we can take this concept of context and personas and begin to integrate that. We need legislation aimed at outcomes, not specific technologies. I want to thank Andrew for pointing that out a while ago. The European cookie policy is a prime example of trying to regulate a technology, and they didn't get the outcome they wanted. And technology is like cockroaches. It scurries to find a path. And then incentives for relying parties to do the right thing. So for those of us who've been laboring in the fields of federated identity for what feels like 20 years, and is almost 20 years actually, we've been doing a lot of the work in federated infrastructure. We've been ignoring user experience. In fact, we thought users didn't want to have any part of this experience. But in fact, we have to move over the next 5 years heavily into user experience. Most of the infrastructure is in place. We're still doing dynamic metadata and a few other things. But the work ahead of us is going to be in end user experience. So, as Lucas said, we have to look at the use of attributes versus identifiers. If you lead with identity, you're lost. You can't recover. But when identifiers are used versus identity, you have some hope, but you got to pick your identifiers carefully. And so we've had interesting conversations over the last couple of days here at Terrainer about opaque identifiers and identifiers, that are targeted and not targeted. There's a lot of characteristics about these that we need to use. Leading with attributes preserves privacy. It gives us the capability for scale that you won't find other ways. We need to learn how to do bundles. At the ReFeds meeting on Sunday, we started to target a new area of work around meta attributes, because name is a wonderful example of, oh my God, that's really complicated when you look at it, when you handle Spanish surnames, when you handle Lady Gaga. Anybody know her real name? What is she supposed to send when she goes to a website? Kind of thing. So we need a meta attribute around name and a few others. I think phone number is the other one that jumps out. So that work will be starting in the ReFed space. And then we're doing an activity as far as our grant, which is called Lifestyles of the Attribute Rich and Privacy Preserved. Robin Leach is no longer with us to give us that wonderful opening about this, but in fact, we want to be attribute rich and we want to be privacy preserved. LARP is not live action role playing. By the way, this is a potential Republican congressman from Florida. I don't think he's going to run for office at this point, but when this photo got out, it was... So it is not, LARP is not live action role-playing. It is, in fact, a set of avatar institutions that are actively working to complete the original federated identity vision as it was shaped many years ago. Sponsored by the NSTIC grant. Key topics will include the consent tools. We want it to be informed. We want it to be revocable, and that technically is very hard. Revocation has been hard, whether it was PKI or other mechanisms, it's still hard. We're looking at accessibility as well. That's a particular target for us. There's some very powerful work being done internationally that I'll mention in a minute. Veterans, and we're doing some work with anonymous credentials, but not much. End user consent. The growing pain of federation, it's actually attribute retentive institutions. And so users turn to Gmail because it spills everything. It's self-asserted, but it's out, all those attributes come in. In fact, we're talking about putting filters. We run a social DSAML gateway. We're talking about putting a filter so that the privacy manager sits on this side of the social DSAML gateway. All of the attributes come splashing in from Gmail, and the campus doesn't want all those attributes. It doesn't want the liability of knowing that information. So it's going to filter from the core dump of attributes that Google gives to just one or two attributes, perhaps, that the institution needs. Deeply influenced by the approach that Switch has been doing in terms of promoting consent as needed in international contexts. That's a very, very powerful lever, and I'm using that in the US as well. It's the right thing to do, but we need to make this not too intrusive. So out of that, we've funded perhaps one of the best groups in the world in usable privacy and security, the computer science department at Carnegie Mellon University in the US, to do the design of basically the next generation of UApprove. And they've been focusing on usability, degree and frequency. Informed consent is a particular target I'll talk about in a second. Accessible, awareness of outer band, the ability to accommodate things like nudging as I described, and it initializes to minimum disclosure for constrained purposes. So the name of the software right now is Privacy Lens, though it loads and it names its files UApprove, so it's that much built on top of it. It's out there at 0.5, and what I'm going to show you is 0.5. So a lot of distance still to go. And we need your inputs, and I've gotten a lot already about that. It's a well-researched and a clear UI. It does informed consent with hierarchical structuring. It defaults to minimal release. The first time that I go to a website and Privacy Lens comes up, it comes up in a minimum release configuration in order for the application to work. Not to work well or not to work fancy, but minimal. So it comes up minimal, but then it gives you the options, because the relying party wants it, of being able to expand that. It has affirmative actions and some of these other things associated with it. This is an early screenshot of that. I actually have the, can we switch? The video is also up on the Terreno website from the researchers. And this is their presentation. Here's some of the desiderata that they've used. And here's the current version of that screen. A couple of things to notice. It comes up in minimal setting. After you've gone to a site, it will now come up in your last used settings, but first time it comes up minimal. It has these clear sliders. It has the value of the attribute being released. It has an indication about whether or not it's mandatory. It has these little I buttons, which is the secret sauce for informed consent. It has settings and history and explanations. It will have room for a trust mark as we get into trust marks. And it doesn't say continue, it says yes, no. It turns out that in the research, it's a fundamental different concept that is triggered in humans by yes, no versus continue. Merely that change of wording is consequential in the thought processes that we go through. I'm not going to go through the rest of this. Again, the video is up on the website, and you can see log files, informed consent, where the structure of the informed consent is reflecting those privacy concerns that I identified in an earlier slide. Again, early on, we invite you to play with this and get back to and get inputs back to us. Could we go back to the slide deck? Great work, thank you. So I'm not going to continue with all of that. You saw a little bit of the informed consent pieces and required attributes. So how does it serve those spectrum of users in the Western privacy indices? Well, for the fundamentalists, there's fine-grained attribute release. There's a variety of informed consent mechanisms. One of the ones they're most interested in exploring is reputation systems. What do my friends release to this website? They're also interested in machine-based approaches. Based upon your history in going to sites with this kind of trust mark, we suggest that this might be the appropriate attribute release policy. They're going to look at subscription services. Wouldn't I want to buy Roland's privacy release settings? Because I have such confidence in Roland that I know I will release everything to a Python site and nothing to a C++ site. For the pragmatics, the first use is minimal release, and in recurring use, it comes up last used. For the unconcerned, I can set this so I never see the damn screen again, which killed my demo when I was playing with this, because, but a separate issue. Okay. We're going to move to version 1.0. We want to share it internationally. The informed consent mechanisms. We have to add bundles. We want to add an UMA backend capability, which I'll turn over to Roland. But in fact, we want the dialog. There will be a click box in the dialog which will say, do you want this attribute release policy to be accessible when you're not online by relying parties? And that's part of the goodness of UMA, and we already have working code, not in Python, that can do that. We're porting the same privacy manager to other protocols because we don't care about the protocol. We just care about the human brain and the wetware. Okay. One other thing to note about this is that we think we can provide data to researchers for the first time ever, because we know how to anonymize. We do identifiers really well. That's about all we ever do. And so we want to get into that space. Some of the other stuff that's happening in terms of solving the privacy paradox is, at least in the US, we're seeing the emergence of trust marks. And trust marks are very crisply defined procedures and attributes that enable, and audits that enable you to have some confidence about the nature of the website that you're visiting. So it might be that the website is accessible. It might be that it is COPPA compliant. The trust marks that we're going to be using are being developed as we speak. I'm interested in trust marks for human consumption. In that UI that I just showed, the trust mark will come through, and that's why I've been asking in every meeting, gee, does RNS have an icon? Because I need the icon kind of stuff. But there's another group in the US doing machine-readable trust marks, and out of that we have come up with the metadata about trust marks that a lot of us have talked about in hallways but never set down. And now we have a pretty good structure about a trust mark. I'm almost out of time, and so I'll hop over all of these marks. Research needs and privacy. I think I'm into the next to last slide. We need to legislate outcomes, not technologies. Technologies don't kill privacy. Business models do. And incentives are needed, and this talks a little bit about that. And so to wrap, I think we're starting to fit the pieces together. We've been all working in little corners in various things, and then along comes Privacy Lens, which can pull in the trust marks. It can span protocols. It can be effective with users, and hopefully it will incent some of the behavior in the marketplace that we want to do. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Ken, for this introduction into the topic and for setting the stage. We still have time for one or two questions from the audience. There is a question over there, please.
Thanks for your presentation. I had one question after hearing about access to the attributes if you're online. Does that mean that the attributes are actually stored somewhere else centrally, and that is a central instance that is releasing them, or do you have them on your own machine? Who actually has access to the attributes before you've shared them?
Well, in our federated instance, it's the IDP that's holding the attributes, and so they're available. Hopefully your IDP is up 7 by 24. That doesn't say that the IDP is authoritative on generating those attributes. It may have picked them up from other sources of authority. Attributes like citizenship, et cetera, may need to come from a higher source of authority, but we're assuming simplistically that all of them are in the IDP because of the attribute aggregation issues. We're not quite there yet, but we know how to do fairly good attribute aggregation. So the answer is they're online in the IDP, and that's where you're controlling them.
Yeah, someone who squarely falls in the top category of that one slide with the 3 categories, I would be a bit worried about that.
I think implicit in the federated model is you got to trust somebody, and if who you're trusting you don't like, go and find somebody else to trust, but you're going to need a broker to manage your attributes in the larger world. You can look at anonymous credentials. We have looked at other technologies that attempt to avoid, that keep it on your desktop. I can't tell you the pain of trying to master those technologies. They continue to be not ready for prime time, and given the multiplicity of devices, you need them on all of your devices at this point, so you get into portability issues, and then how does that work with informed consent? So our experience with anonymous credentials has reinforced that a trusted identity provider is an asset in the world.
One quick question.
Christoph Witzig from Switch. I have a question. What is the timeline for the version 1, and will that be available on ship 3?
Great questions. Timeline for V1 is probably the fall, depending upon the number of inputs. And so, for example, some of the flavor of input I've gotten already from Leif, he looked at the screen and he said, I'll bet you more people will release their name if you don't put the value in the screen. And I don't know that. We have to test it out. One of the good things of working with academics is they do rigorous testing, unlike those of us who think we're the data point for the world. In terms of V3, we've been in conversation with Scott from the very beginning about how does this work on top of SHIB V3. I don't know if Scott's in the room or not, but Scott's answer was, you're going to have to throw it all away. I can't imitate Scott. I said, wait, do I have to throw away the UI? Oh, no, not that. Do I have to throw away the log files and the informed consent? Oh, you don't have to throw that away. What do I have to throw away, Scott? 6 lines of plumbing. So for those of us who want to imprint users with this mindset, we can feel safe in that it will work on V3. We've tucked away a little bit of money to make it work on V3, so yes.
Okay, well, thank you once again, Ken. I know there were some additional questions, but Ken still will be around, so use the time in the break to ask the questions personally. Now, we come to the next presentation, which is given by Bob Hulsebosch. Bob is working for a consulting company called Innovalor. It's a company, a Dutch company, which is also active in, or mostly active in identity federations. And Bob is talking about different ways how licensing can be used in the context of federated identity management.
Okay, thank you very much, Lucas. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to present in this talk to you some of the outcomes of a research project we did together with SurfNet on group-based licensing and authorizations. See if that works. Okay, the research was motivated by the fact that we saw that in research and education, the use of cloud computing, of cloud services, is increasing rapidly. And the licensing models that are used in this cloud environment are completely different compared to the traditional license models of campus-based licenses. They are characterized by short-term contracts, licenses that you can use on a monthly period, or even on a weekly, or even on a daily basis. Concepts like on-the-fly access to services, pay-as-you-go, are completely alien to campus license structures. So you have to be able to deal with that. But it's not only the type of license that changes in cloud environments, it's also the user base that's different. Typically the user base is smaller, more dynamic, small groups of users that want to make use of cloud services. For instance, virtual collaborations, project teams, things like that. And from a institutional point of view, you want to control access to these cloud services. You don't want the whole university, all the users, to get access to these services, particularly not in a pay-as-you-go model, because at the end of the month you get a huge bill that you don't want to pay. Also from a service provider perspective, it's nice to have some control about the use of your resources. to prevent misuse. If you sell a license for, let's say, 20 users, then you don't want to have 200 users playing around in your cloud. To illustrate, I have listed here a number of use cases that characterize the differences that you can have with groups and licenses. For instance, an institution that buys a license at a service provider for its 2,000 users. A faculty leader that buys a license for 50 faculty members. Or there is a project manager that buys a license for its 7 project members that are distributed across multiple institutions. So you have to be able to deal with that. So the objective and goals of this research topic that we did together with SurfNet were to explore models for enforcing group-based access control to cloud services. And we also wanted to play a bit with these models and build 1 or 2 proof of concepts to see if the models are technically realistic and feasible. So we sat back, we did some thinking, we did some desktop research, and we also talked a lot to SurfMarket. And SurfMarket is in the Netherlands, is a reseller of licenses for universities, research institutions, education. And based on on that input, we came to 3 models to do license-based, or group license-based access control. The first model is the traditional model. That's daily practice today. It's a service provider-centric model. In this case, the service provider controls the group. Examples of such service providers are Viadesk for online collaboration. A second model is an identity provider-centric approach, where the identity provider, or the institution, controls the group. Examples of these are SurfSpot, MS DreamSpark, and Rationale Online. For instance, SurfSpot makes use of the student attribute to grant students access to software that they can buy for a reduced price. A third model is a group-centric model. In this case, we have a dedicated group management environment that the group manager can use to manage his group, to manage the group members, and so on. An example of this model is used by GreenCloud that makes use of this model. GreenCloud is a cloud provider that offers virtual machines in the cloud. So if we take a more detailed look at each of these models, and we start with the service provider-centric model, we see that in the Surf Connect federation environment, we see a user that wants to get access to a service provider. The service provider, in this case, manages, controls the group. So he needs to authenticate via the Surf Connect hub towards the identity provider. And then his identity is communicated to the service provider, and he gets access because he is in the group. Now, this is daily practice. The advantages of this model are that the service provider is in control. So if he sells a license to an institution, let's say for 20 users, then he can control, he can count the users, and if there are more than 20 users, then he can block them or do something else, but at least he's in control. And it is easy to realize. The drawbacks of this model is that you cannot reuse groups across multiple service providers. If you have a group that makes use of, let's say, 3 different service providers, for each service provider you have to provision the group context. And that can be a lot of work. Furthermore, it's not very easy to have cross-institutional groups in this model. If users from a group are from different institutions, then it's difficult to realize such a model. You have to coordinate a bit more between the identity providers and the service providers. The second model, the identity provider-centric model, here you see that the identity provider is in control of the group. So the operator of the identity provider is managing the group. Now, if a user wants to get access to a service provider, again, via the Surf Connect hub, he has to authenticate towards the identity provider, and the identity provider returns a group attribute, a student attribute, for instance, to the service provider, and based upon that attribute, the student will be granted access to the service. The advantages of this model is that the identity provider or the institution is in control. So it can control the costs that are associated to the usage of the service. Furthermore, it's relatively easy to realize in a federated environment once the service provider and the identity provider have agreed upon the attributes that they want to exchange for allowing access. In this case, the student attribute. The drawbacks of this model are that it doesn't scale very well. If you have multiple and dynamic groups, small groups, then the identity provider operator has to manage all these groups, and that's not his core business. And moreover, the identity provider operator doesn't really know what groups are around at an institution. So that's not his thing. And if you want to facilitate that, you may offer a self-service interface to group managers in this case. It also doesn't work very easy for groups consisting of members of different institutions. Then the IDPs have to do something together to realize that. In the group-centric approach, that's a more complex architecture. There we see that we have a separate and dedicated group manager service, and some kind of an attribute provider in the federation. It provides group membership attributes. And it offers a group management interface to the group manager itself. So the group manager, the guy who is really responsible for the group, can manage via this interface his group. Now, if a user wants to get access to a service provider, again, he has to authenticate towards his identity provider. But during the authentication session, in this case, ServConnect goes to the group management service and asks if this user is a member of a certain group. If that's the case, the group ID will be communicated to the service provider, and based on this group ID, the user will be granted access. Now, if you look at the pros and cons of this model, you see that we need group management functionality, dedicated group management, a service provider or an attribute provider that does this. And if you have in this model, then it's important that the attributes, the group membership attributes that are provided by this group service provider, can be trusted by the service provider itself. So the service provider, the cloud provider, needs to trust the group membership attributes that come from this provider. So it needs to be a trusted third party. What you can also achieve with this model is that you can reuse group contexts across multiple services. Each time ServConnect goes to this a group service provider and checks if there are group membership attributes for the specific user. It can also allow for group members from other institutions. The drawbacks of this model is that you need to adjust your architecture. The ServConnect architecture doesn't support it at the moment because you have to introduce a new attribute provider in your federation, and attribute providers are not very common yet. Also, the service provider needs to do something. It needs to be able to use the attributes that it receives from ServConnect for access control decisions, and these are group memberships attributes. Now, based on this analysis, we decided to do two proof of concepts. One with the identity provider-centric model and one with the group-centric model. And the identity provider-centric model we did with the University of Amsterdam and the Rationale Online tool. That's a mind mapping tool. That was not a real proof of concept because it was already in production for a group of about 400 students of a specific study year that is allowed to make use of Rationale. And then the authorization was based on an entitlement attribute. The second proof of concept was a group-centric model. And we did it together with SurfNet and GreenCloud. They have a limited group of users, distributed across multiple institutions in a test environment this time with fake users. And authorization was based on the group ID attribute, which is the same as a license ID. So in the Dutch situation, if an institution buys a license, then at Serve Market, then Serve Market creates a license ID, and this license ID is communicated to the service provider. So when you enter the service with this license ID, then you get access. And what we did is we made the license ID and the group ID the same. Now, if we focus on the University of Amsterdam rationale proof of concept, then this is the architecture. We have the rationale service, and a user goes to this service, and he has to authenticate again. Then the identity provider checks at the LDAP system if there is an 80% entitlement attribute that is specifically defined for rationale. If that user has this attribute, then it will be returned to the rationale online, and the user will be granted access. Very straightforward, very simple. But if you start evaluating this proof of concept, then there are some drawbacks. It doesn't scale at all at the identity provider side, due to a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that you cannot very easily reuse default existing groups that are in the LDAP system. There are always exceptions. There are always things, in this case, a teacher that you have to add to the student group, or several other students that come from another group that needs to be integrated. And that costs a lot of work. Also, the group contexts that you want to reuse typically are not in the LDAP system. They come from other systems, like the student registration system or the HR system. So it doesn't work very well. Also, you have to deprovision after the end of the year. So you have to remove all these 400 students, or at least the attribute behind their name. And you have to provision again for the next year to prevent contamination. So the identity provider operator is very busy with that. You cannot add users from other institutions. And if you have multiple user groups at the University of Amsterdam that want to make use of Rationale Online, that have different licenses, then it's very difficult to cater with this approach for that situation. Then you have to introduce multiple Rationale Online specific attributes for the University of Amsterdam. And at the moment, University of Amsterdam is not very happy with this model, and she's reconsidering developing an own group service for the whole university that can be used as an attribute provider for these scenarios. Then we have the second proof of concept with GreenCloud and SurfNet. Then a user goes to GreenCloud, and then again he has to authenticate. The IDP gives the identifier, and what then happens is that SurfConnect goes to, in this case, Serve Market to check if this user is a member of a certain group. And if this is the case, then this identifier will be returned back. If the user is a member of multiple groups, then you have a problem. Then you have to implement an which group are you from functionality to allow the user to select his group. You don't want to communicate all the groups to the service provider, because that's a privacy issue. So you ask the user to select one of the groups, and then it will be communicated to GreenCloud, and GreenCloud can do its thing. We implemented it like this. So here you see a mock-up of the Serve Market portal, where an institution can an institution can buy a license. And in this case, it's the GreenCloud license. And you can also select the size of the group of the license from, in this case, 20 users. And what you can also do is you can enter the email address of the group manager. Because typically the user that is the person that is buying the license at the university is not the same person as the group manager. So we enter the email address of the group manager, and then this group manager gets an email that a license has bought for his group, and a dedicated group management environment has been created for him for this license, and he can enter this group management system. In this case, serve teams. Then he has to log in, and then he can start managing his group. He can enter email addresses of group members, and these group members will get an email invitation. And he can also enter an email address of a user from another institution. That's no problem. So then this team member gets an email invitation with a link in it. He clicks on the link. He logs in at at Serve Teams, and then he gets access to the group. And he can also get access to Green Cloud because he's a member of the team, of the group. If we evaluate this proof of concept, again we see that a group management service is required, Serve Teams, and it allows for invitation of team members from other universities. So that's nice. But it also comes with a lot of group management issues, I would say. It starts with who's the group manager? Does the guy who buys the license know who the group manager is? That's a good question. What if the institution member is, the institution of the member that is invited by the group manager is not federated with Green Cloud? Then you should warn the group manager that this is the situation, that this team member that he wants to invite cannot make use of Green Cloud because this institution is not federated yet with Green Cloud. And the group manager typically will not know that. Another thing what could happen is that the institution is not in a federation at all. And you have other problems. And sometimes a group member can also be a member of a private company. And most of the licenses that are sold to research and education are only meant for use by that domain, by that community. And it cannot be used by private companies. So you have to be able to deal with that in your license agreements. So this is something for Serve Market, for instance, to take into account when they are negotiating new licenses for the community. Which group are you from functionality is required. And another tricky issue is who's going to make the authorization decisions, particularly in the hub and spoke model like Serve Connect has. Does Serve Connect do that? For instance, if a user wants to log in at Green Cloud and is not a member of a team, then Serve Connect can detect that, can see that, and it can say, well, sorry, you cannot access Green Cloud. It can offer to these kind of users a consistent interface in an understandable manner, and that they are redirected to the university's license manager, for instance. Or you can say, we leave it as it is, and we move it to Green Cloud and let Green Cloud decide what to do. And Green Cloud can then make an offer for this user to buy a license, for instance. And we tend to go to the second model. So to conclude, we've seen that there are 3 models for managing group-based access for group licenses. And there is not a single model that can facilitate all the use cases that you can think of. So the service provider-centric model is daily practice. It's very easy. The responsibilities are clearly defined. The service provider is in control. But its capabilities are very limited. The IDP-centric model scales very badly, but it can be useful if you have relatively large and static user groups, like the student group. Then the group-centric model, it offers a lot of flexibility, a lot of possibilities, but it also introduces complexity. It introduces the group management complexity. And we think it works best for small and dynamic user groups that are distributed across multiple institutions. And it's very important that in this model there have to be a trust relation between the group service provider, the attribute provider, and the service providers, the cloud service providers themselves. They have to trust the attributes that come from this group service provider. And we think that the Serve Market, in our case in the Netherlands, is ideally positioned to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bob. We still have plenty of time for questions, and now Peter finally can ask a question.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I just wanted to note that the group-based approach also can very nicely work without a centralized federation like the hub and spoke. And maybe even better, because some of your problems that you have would not exist in a federated environment. So we meaning Daria project have been setting up a thing like that, quite similar to your approach. So maybe if you go back two slides, then I'll remember what I wanted to say. Yes. So who makes authorization decisions? Of course, if you don't have a hub, it is clear that the SP always does and the SP can also make the decision not only on basis of the group information, but also on basis on other information the SP got from the IDP, not the attribute authority, but the IDP. So then the SP can decide, yes, that's a member of affiliation of organization X, which is a customer, and secondly, yes, and additionally, this member is member of the group.
Yeah.
So so that's just what I wanted to say. It might even work better in a non-hub and spoke environment.
A comment and a question. The comment is, in the US, a number of campuses allow people to create their own groups using Grouper. And in those instances, the directory has wound up holding more groups than individuals in the directory. Which is a very interesting phenomenon.
Yeah.
That said,
it's challenging.
My question is, do you see, one of the things in forming a group is picking people. We call that the people picker. And we think there are privacy issues in displaying names so that you can pick people to put in your group. Do you see privacy issues in that process?
You mean during the invitation process? Or?
Well, it's even before invitation. Because you pick the people from a list, and then you send them invitations to join the group.
Yeah.
But it's showing the list.
Yeah, the idea here is that the group manager doesn't have a list. It can be his project members, but then he knows whose members in the projects are. And if it's a very long list, then there's a privacy issue. Some not, some that's good. And also the group membership itself, of course, is a privacy issue. So you don't want to communicate all the groups a user is a member of in this model. You have to filter.
I see another use case for this group wave. I think it could also be used for selecting roles when you have multiple roles. For instance, you're a lecturer and also a student, and you would like to enter an LMS to get a student view or a lecturer view. Then you have to select the role, and I think this would perfectly fit into this tool as well.
Yeah. If it doesn't become too intrusive for the end user, if this wave becomes huge and with roles and groups and so, but it is good. Yeah, that would be an additional use case for this wave.
Yeah, maybe as a quick addition to Ken's question on picking users, the typical setup of the Teams application is to not allow the picking of people from a list, but to force the person who invites somebody to type in the email. So he has to have some prior knowledge out of band, so to say, of this people's email address, of this person's email address. That has pros and cons. I mean, clearly from a privacy perspective, a very good thing probably. But well, hey, how do you find out someone's email address if you actually don't know the email address? So, yeah, it has pros and cons.
Yeah.
Maybe one last question from David.
Do you agree that the authorization decision is always with the service provider? It may delegate the responsibility or the decision to the IDP, in this case managing the roles and the groups, but it's still the service provider's responsibility as they are the resource owner.
Yeah. They are the ones that enforce the policy.
Yep. Okay. Good. Thank you.
Okay, well then let's thank Bob again once for this very nice overview about group licensing. Now we come to the third and last presentation in this session, and it will be given by Roland Hedberg, who is a senior researcher at UMIA University. Those who know Roland, and that's probably the majority in this room, know that Roland is a very enthusiastic Python programmer, and he will also be giving a demo about attribute release. So he would like to show a way how users get more control about the release of their attributes. And yeah, so I give the words to Roland.
I should start by apologizing for my bad throat. So I may start coughing some way sort of down the line here. So just bear with me. I will resurface eventually. Anyway, I'm a tool maker, you could say. I make tools for people to sort of do things for them. Mostly sort of proof of concept things. So anyway, one of the things I've been working on lately is, I see, which oh gosh, okay. Oh, by the way, I'd like to make a comment to one of the things that David Putnam did at the presentation now, at the keynote. I don't know how many listened to that, but one of the things he said that we should actually educate women, and that was the most important things to do right now. I looked up how many women there are at this conference. It's like 15% of the participants are women, and about equal actually when it comes to presenters. I was at the Python conference in the US, actually it was in Canada, a couple of weeks ago. The percentage of women was 33%. That was a very highly technical conference. How did that come about? Well, they actually have something called Pi Ladies, which is a group of women who have decided there has to be more women in this. So I'd like to see the TNC ladies step up so that next year there at least are 33% of the participants being women. Okay, thank you. What I'm going to talk about here is UMA, User Managed Access. How many have heard about UMA at all? A few. Okay, good. Because this is going to be a 101 on UMA. This is going to be the basics. So my goal is that when you leave this room, you have a basic understanding of what you can do with UMA. Limits and sort of pro and cons when it comes to UMA. I will also eventually do a demo, and actually fits in very nicely with what Ken was talking about earlier. So everything I've done with UMA so far has been paid by Jean. So I'm the task leader for this task, the terrible name, which isn't pronounceable. So it's one work item within that. It's my UMA work. UMA is something that comes out of an organization called Kantara. And Kantara deals with interoperability, sort of getting things to work on the internet. And there is a UMA working group within Kantara. And sorry. the goal then is for this is to develop then the spec that leads to that individual can control access to their resources. Individual here is probably a person, but could also sort of be an entity. That is sort of it could be a role, for instance, or something like that. Someone having a role. UMA is based on OAuth. OAuth 2, actually. Sort of. OAuth 2 has 3 entities, you could say. It has the resource server, it has the authorization server, and it has the client. And you can also add, to some extent, the resource owner. So all the specification in the documentation about OAuth 2 is only talking about these 3 components and how they fit together. In fact, if we looked at the implementations, then there is a need for the resource server and the authorization server to be run by the same organization, actually sort of very tightly bound to each other. Otherwise, nothing will work, because there is nothing specified about how they should know that they actually are talking about the same thing. So what UMA has done, it's stripped apart these. So they added the resource owner as an own entity. It added the resource requester, which is also a separate entity. And it moved the authorization server and the resolver server apart from each other. It meant that we had to add some things. And this is what this talk will be about, sort of how do we make this fit together. So it starts by, you have the resource owner, and she is, I don't know why, called Alice. So that's Alice. She introduces, she has a relationship to the resource server. And the resource server may hold any type of resources. It may be sort of files in a file system. It can be of different types. It can photographs, sort of, it can be videos or anything. It can be information like identity information. It could be other types of things. And what Alice wants is that her authorization server is controlling the access to the resources in the resource server. So she has to introduce these 2. They don't know each other beforehand. So she does that. And this is basic OAuth. So you do the login stuff, and eventually you will get what's called an access token. And it's called the PAT in this case. When the resource server has sort of made this connection to the authorization server and gotten the token, it uploads information to the authorization server about the resources that are to be controlled, whose access are to be controlled by the authorization server. So this is that. You register resources. This is what typically sort of it would be about when this description. You have a name of what this resource is. You have an icon, which is something you would like to show to the user so he understands what type of resource it is. And scopes, which is very interesting. Scopes are what you can do with the resource. Where this came from was sort of web resources. What can you do with the web resource? You can get it. You can create it by using post. You can modify it by using put. You can delete it. Things like that. That's typically sort of what scope started off with being. But scopes can be other things also. Imagine, for instance, that you have a photograph. Then scopes could be different views of the same photograph. So it could be sort of the raw photograph with the raw format. It could be the GIF format of the picture. It could be sort of a GIF format, but it's 600 by 300 or 100 by 50 or something like Type sort of something that usually machine readable and define some of the semantics of what the resource is about. And then, since resources in most cases are built up by smaller resources, you could say, you have these subsets. So in that, you can list sort of any other resources that is a part of this resource. Like if you have a person, you have all the attributes, and then you have values of attributes. There's sort of 3 levels. This is something you could use then for represent that. When now the authorization server knows about these resources, Alice can contact the authorization server and set up the permissions. This can actually happen either in advance, so in which case, if you know who is going to access the resources, or you know some kind of well, if you know, for instance, this is students who are going to access this resource, or it's this specific person, it's Lucas who is going to access the resource, you can go and set up these rules beforehand. But there is also a possibility that you allow people to try to access the resource, and then you get, as a resource owner, you get a message saying, now, someone tried, well, actually say, Victoriano tried to access this resource, but he wasn't allowed because you hadn't given him any permission. And then you're allowed to go into this authorization interface, add this, or if you want to, of course, add this permission for Victoriano and say that now he can do this, and then the system will send Victoriano a mail saying, now you can try to access the resource. If it's set up in advance, the requester, which is Roger, by the way, contacts the client. The client knows about the API that is going to be used against the resource server, and that is what the client knows about. So it will send the first request to the resource server. But the request, and is there a pointer here? Anyway. So there is nothing in that request except the request. There is no additional information about the client or the requester. So the resource server in this instance will just answer, I don't know who you are. So you should go to the authorization server and identify yourself, because it's the authorization server who decides eventually about access. So again, the client contacts the authorization server, does the normal OAuth thingy, the dance, sort of authenticates the user. Roger, in this case, is involved. So the authorization server knows it's the client, and it's Roger who is using the client. Again, it issues a token, an AAT, and by using the AAT, the client could get what's called RPT, which is something it then uses to send to the resource server to prove that now the authorization server knows who I am, accepted that I actually can access this resource server. But still, this resource ticket is empty because there is nothing yet set up as to if this is allowed by the authorization server or not. What the resource server does with this RPT, it does what's called introspection. So it sends it to the authorization server asking what kind of permissions are granted by this token. And again, as we said, there is nothing at this point. So the resource server then makes a translation all what the client tried to do, like doing get on the resource, into the set of permissions that is necessary for the client to get this access. And it sends this set of permissions to the authorization server. And what the authorization server does is it sends back a ticket to the resource server, which just forwards it to the client, and then the client will present this ticket to the authorization server. And at this point, the authorization server may decide that it has to know more about Roger. So it will ask for extra information about Roger. And it could be sort of a SAML assertion, or it could be a OpenID Connect claim set. But extra information about Roger, and if it fulfills what is specified by Alice, he will get a new RPT, which now is connected to the necessary permissions. Client sends it to resource server. The resource server does an introspection again to the authorization server. The authorization server sends back the set of permissions that this was connected to this token. And the resource server then, if it will act on that, those permissions, and send back the information that was allowed to be returned. The next time Roger wants to access it, the client already has the RPT, so you don't have to go through all these stands again. It can send the RPT directly, and it will get the permission. But it's also important to note that Alice, at any point in time, can go to the authorization server and invalidate this and say, I don't give you this permission anymore. So this is then sort of the move from access management 1.0 to 2.0. It goes from complex to RESTful. It goes for usually proprietary to a standard interop-based, which is like you don't want to use you-approve anymore, because that's something which is proprietary. It's specific for Shibboleth. Instead, you want to use something which is standardized. Sorry. Since it's the OAuth and everything like that, it's actually very mobile friendly. And it's agnostic against the authentication methods. It's also actually quite, and I think that's maybe one of the both really good things and really problematic things when it comes to describing resource sets. It may not be expressive enough for doing this properly, and at the same time, there has to be a lot of standardization around this. Actually, there are a couple of projects right now working on ontologies for resource sets. So what I did then, I had a SAML implementation, I had the UMA implementation, so I tried to merge these two. So I have these pieces. I have a SP, I have an IDP, and I have the UMA components. I have the resource server, I have the authorization server, and I have the client. And then I have Alice. So how would I put this together? I chose to do it this way. So I placed the client in the IDP, and I placed the resource server and the authorization server outside. What does this mean? Well, it means that you can actually have an authorization server outside your organization. You probably don't want that. But there are actually some use cases where that fits very nicely. It also separates the IDP from the resource server, in this case, the attribute provider, you could say. I mean, if you see the resource server, you can imagine sort of an LDAP server with something in front who makes it a UMA resource server. So that could also be outside your organization, under control of someone else. So, but that was my personal choice, and one of the reasons I made this choice was because I wanted to actually use every API, sort of keep everything open, so I could look at everything. But it means also there's a lot of traffic. And that's one of the things you probably got from my walkthrough here, is that there are a lot of packets sent around, lots of sort of interactions between these guys. So, a short demo. See if we can switch this. Yeah, good. Okay, so this is the first piece now. You won't see sort of a lot. This is typically when you do demo about middleware. You won't see anything of what's really happening, sort of. But that's just how it is. So this is the first. Alice, though in this case she's called Linda, chooses the authorization server. So she connects to the resource server and logged in. You didn't see the login. That's because I have this new authentication method using sort of Aura mapping. So it reads my Aura and does the login. You don't believe me? Oh, gosh.
You have Linda's Aura.
Exactly. So now I can do this. This is a feature of sort of using OAuth. Actually, it's OpenID Connect, you could say. So I can add an identifier, which looks like an email address.
Can you make it a little bigger?
Sure. Sufficient?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, I should have an off button when I start coughing. Anyway, yes. So this something like that looks like an email address. It could also actually be a URL. There's another couple of things you can use, but anyway. So this is the user I want to authenticate as at the authorization server, which is a OAuth authorization server also. So what the resource server in this case does is that it takes this domain part, localhost, and the port number, and it goes there, it looks up, who are you, what can you do, where's your endpoints? So it dynamically downloads the metadata, and then it can start talking to him. So, as I said, all in the background, sort of. So what happened was that you had this authentication with the authorization server. You had the transfer of resource sets and all that kind of stuff. So, let's see. So now you want to go and, sorry, I have to decrease the size a bit. So, okay. So now it's about sort of choosing the resource set. In this case, it's just one, because there is one user. I can choose which SP this is about, and I have downloaded sort of the metadata now. This is the SWAMID metadata, so it's all the SPs we have in there. I'm going to use that one. I want to add the permission for that SP, and it's my attribute values. At some point in time, Alice decided this was the granularity she wanted. And as Ken said, you may not want to go down to attributes. You want attribute values. You may want to stay at attributes or bundles of attributes. But I'm not a user interface guy, so as you see, no fancy colors or anything. So anyway, I can pick a couple of these. Oh, by the way, maybe you should vote so you can see that actually I'm not faking it. But how would we do that? Anyway, let's pick every other one. Like that. And add this permission. Oh, it's stored. And now I connect to the SP. And this SP is only configured with metadata for one IDP. So there is no wave, no disco use, or anything like that. I just boom into the IDP. And I got these attributes I asked for. Did you remember the attributes? No one did, so you don't know if it is correct or not. Well, actually, it was. Yes, yes. Exactly. So, short demo. Actually works. Done. Go switch back. So next up for the working group, we need more hands-on people. We need more use cases. So if you want to get involved, please become a humanitarian. I love that. So our chair, Eve Mahler, that coined that. I really like it. I'm writing the interoperability test suite for UMA, so if you have a UMA implementation, come to me, and I will verify your implementation. Apart from that, this is the URL that you may be interested in. It's the website for me and my group. There's a lot of interesting stuff. If you're a Python programmer, this is really paradise. Okay, that's it.
Thank you very much, Roland Python Hedberg. We still have time for one or two questions. Everybody wants to go and get the coffee. No questions. Well, you said you approve. Well, it's proprietary. Of course, that's true. But still, it's open source. It's a plugin for Shibboleth IDP, which is kind of the de facto standard. And well, this work is right now. It's research, right? So where do you see UMA in 2 years, and how do you think UMA could be integrated optimally within popular assembler products? So what would be needed for that?
UMA within 2 years' time. Well, first I should say that in 2 years' time, I think that whether we are using SAML or OpenID Connect is still perhaps undecided, but really, sort of, I hope that within 2 years' time, UMA will actually be out as a standard. And I hope that people who are dealing with authorization and letting user control their resources will use UMA and not use something else. Sort of. Because if we were to, if like for instance, the tool that Ken was talking about,
Privacy Lens.
Sorry?
Privacy Lens.
Privacy Lens, exactly. If it's built on UMA, on the standard UMA, then it could easily be used with any other SAML implementation or OpenID Connect implementation.
We have done that. I didn't show that, but Keith has made a connection between you-approved Privacy Lens and UMA. So this is all very doable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think that sort of the what you have learned from you approve is, and what also comes from Ken, is the user interface. And that's sort of important probably to keep sort of, but what's in the background is really sort of, we could easily switch that. And we should do that, I think.
Any more questions? No? Well then let's thank Roland again.